Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Tabletop Show, in which I take a look at various tabletop games and give you a brief overview of them, as well as give you some examples of play. So, I've made a couple of videos on Dungeons & Dragons before, but they were very messy and scatterbrained, and that's not what I'm going to be doing anymore from here on out. I'm not going to give any of those really weird scatterbrained overviews of entire series across multiple editions and that sort of thing, because that can just get pretty confusing for everybody involved, including myself. So, instead, I'm going to be doing a bit more of a narrow focus here, and I'm going to talk specifically about Dungeons & Dragons Basic and give you an idea of how that works. Now, when I say Dungeons & Dragons Basic, I'm really specifically talking about the BX publication of this, because it's really the easiest to understand, and it's the one that most people probably have some experience with if they have experience with D&D Basic. So there were actually three different publications if you want to get really technical with Dungeons & Dragons Basic. There was the BX edition, there's the BECME edition, and then there was the original Holmes publication, which was, if I remember correctly, what they published in the white and red boxes. Anyway, the BX edition just stands for Basic and Expert, and BECME stands for Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and Immortal. And that should give you a general idea of the scope that these two encompass. Basic and Expert, or BX, is the pretty standard version of D&D Basic, and BECME is the expanded version that throws in a bunch of extra levels and spreads out its content quite a bit more. Mechanically, they're almost identical. There's very slight differences between them that you probably won't notice, and the main differences you're going to be seeing are, again, BECME has higher level caps, and it spreads out its content a bit more, and between the two publications you're going to see some slightly different artwork. That's about it. So, as far as Basic goes, I'm going to talk about what you do to create a character first, and then from there I'm going to give you some examples of how you actually play the game. So the first thing you're going to be doing when you create a new character in Dungeons & Dragons is you roll your stats. Now, later editions would expand the ways you can roll this, so you may be used to something different if you played a more recent edition. But the original D&D Basic only has one way of generating stats, and that is to do this. You take your 3d6 and you roll them in order, and that's your stats. So the order of the stats is as follows: Strength, Intelligence, Wisdom, Dexterity, Constitution, and Charisma. And it seems like a very odd order, but that is actually the specific order that the book lists that you need to put them in. And when you roll in D&D Basic, again, you're rolling those stats in order. So for Strength, I rolled a 16, which is pretty impressive because it's 2 lower than the maximum you can roll for that. So you mark that down on your sheet and you move on to the next stat. You roll it again. So let's see what I get for Intelligence here. I rolled a 9. Okay, it's not great for Intelligence, but it's something you can work with. And then you roll it again. And that's a 12 for Wisdom, so not too bad. And so on and so forth. Eventually you get all of your stats. So after you've rolled your stats, the next thing you're going to do is select your character class. And unlike in later editions of D&D, where they greatly expanded the race options as well as the class options, here everything is all put together under character classes. And that's something that not only are people not used to, but it may actually kind of floor you because you're fully expecting to be able to choose your race and your class if you've played more recent role-playing games. In D&D Basic, on the other hand, your class options are as follows. If you're playing a human, you get to be either a fighter, magic user, thief, or cleric, and otherwise, you can play a dwarf, an elf, or a halfling, and that's it. Those are all of your character class options, and each of them do have their own specific abilities, which range from being able to cast spells, or just being able to equip certain items, or being able to pick locks or disarm traps, or anything like that. And something else to note is that if you're used to later editions in the series where your abilities per class are greatly expanded, D&D Basic is, well, again, basic. It's a game from the late 70s and early 80s. They didn't really do a whole lot with regards to the special abilities that each class is going to have. And in some cases, playing a certain class may be downright brutal. So, for example, if you decide to play a cleric, then your level 1 experience is basically going to be whacking things in the face, because you don't get your first spell until level 2 as a cleric in D&D Basic. Meanwhile, if you play a magic user, or mage if you prefer, then you might expect to be able to throw a bunch of spells around all the time, except at level 1, you only get one spell. And that's it. Meanwhile, if you play a fighter, well, they're very straightforward, and thieves are very straightforward, so you never really have to worry about playing something like that in D&D Basic, because they have all their abilities all the time, whereas, again, clerics and magic users are rather limited in what they can actually do as far as their main class abilities go. Whereas you might look at the demi-human classes, the dwarf, the elf, and the halfling, and find that there's not really much reason to play a human if you can play one of those, because dwarves are basically fighters, except they can see in the dark, and elves can also see in the dark, and they can also cast spells, and they can also be pretty decent at fighting. And halflings are basically thieves, but better at saving throws. So, you may wonder why even play a human in those instances. Well, it's because they're more straightforward to play, and you don't have as many things to keep track of. But, that said, a lot of that also depends on your dungeon master and what they will allow you to play, because they may consider the demi-human classes overpowered, or they may not. Or they may just decide that the world is encompassing entirely humans, or whatever the case may be. Anyway, once you have selected your character class after having rolled your stats, the next choice in creating a character is to choose your alignment. Now, alignment is a confusing matter in all editions of Dungeons & Dragons, not just in D&D Basic, but it's less of an issue with more recent entries, where they go into great detail explaining what the alignments actually mean, and how there is actually nuance there. D&D Basic, on the other hand, decides to make things very confusing. There are exactly 3 alignments in this, unlike in later editions, where there are 9. So right off the bat, you may be going, oh, well, that means that it's a lot easier to understand, right? No. Your 3 alignments in D&D Basic are lawful, chaotic, and neutral. And the way it's described is pretty bare bones and really doesn't capture the actual scope of the alignment, which is why, of course, they expanded it in later editions. So if you're lawful, that basically means you're good. If you're chaotic, that basically means you're evil, and neutral is, of course, somewhere in the middle there. It's pretty messy, and it is especially important to be paying great attention to your alignment, because D&D Basic has an incredibly stupid mechanic in it called alignment language. That's right. You can speak the language of your alignment. So if you're a chaotic character, you can speak chaotic. If you are a neutral character, you can speak neutral. What are those? I have absolutely no idea, and I don't think I've ever seen a DM actually use them because they're incredibly dumb ideas. Suffice to say, languages based on alignment were removed in later editions of Dungeons & Dragons for a very good reason, and here all it really does is serve to confuse you an awful lot. Now, they do give you some examples of alignment-based behavior, but even then, that doesn't really capture the nuance of the system very well. Now, after you have rolled your stats, you have selected your class, you've made any adjustments based on your ability scores, and of course your bonuses and penalties based on your class and all that sort of thing, and put all those down on your character sheet, and you have selected your alignment, it is time to do what a lot of people think is the really fun part of playing any role-playing game, which is equipping your character. Now, here's the thing. With Dungeons & Dragons Basic, the way you determine how much money you have at the beginning is the same across all of the classes, which makes things nice and easy. It doesn't have any strange numbers you have to crunch for other classes. You just roll 3d6, and you multiply the result by 10. So, for example, let's roll 3d6. What did we roll? Okay, so that's 100 gold pieces that we've got there. Great. So let's say we're trying to equip a fighter. Well, we go to the table and we consult it to find what weapons and armor we can equip. So let's say that we want our fighter to be wearing plate mail. Okay, that costs 60 gold. Great, we're down to 40. Now we want them to have a sword. Now, D&D Basic is very limited in what equipment is available to you, so you have to keep that in mind. So let's say plate armor and a sword. So the sword, you have your options of short sword, normal sword, which I don't even know what that means, and two-handed sword. We're going to just go ahead and assume that he's going to use a two-handed sword. He's a big burly fighter dude. So that costs an additional 15 gold. Now we're down to 25 gold pieces. And then we can purchase any additional equipment. So for example, let's say we want to get a backpack. Well, that brings us down to 20 gold, and we want to get some lantern and some torches and all sorts of different things like that. Well, you can spend the rest of your gold on whatever other equipment you need. And trust me, if your DM is worth their salt, then they are going to penalize you for every bit of proper adventuring equipment that you do not have. Because of course they are. Because DMs are assholes. I would know. I am a dungeon master. Anyway, suffice to say, the equipment selection is very simple in D&D Basic, and if you're playing any of the non-spellcasting classes, then it is actually the last stage of character creation, in which you, of course, select all your equipment and you add any remaining modifiers that you have. Whereas if you're playing a spellcaster, well, specifically an elf or a magic user at level 1, because clerics don't get spells at level 1, then you also need to determine what spell you have, because you have to have a spell inscribed in your spell book as a magic user or an elf to be able to cast that spell. And at level 1 you only get one spell, level 2 you get 2 spells, so on and so forth, and the DM can determine it or it's up to the player. It depends on the individual DM. If I were running a game like this, ordinarily I would let the player choose their first level spell, and maybe I'd let them choose their second level or third level spells depending on whether or not they actually found some just scattered around their adventure. Regardless, once you've got your spell selected, then your character is done, and you go on and name your character, make sure everything on your sheet is correct, and usually you'll have to go with your DM and determine whether or not there need to be any adjustments made, and at that point you are ready for the adventure. Which does, of course, lead me into the next section of this video, where I'm going to talk about the gameplay. So the gameplay of Dungeons & Dragons Basic is split into two distinct parts. You have the adventure and you have the encounter. And in order to show you what that's like, I need to zoom in here and give you an idea of what you're dealing with. So let's say you've got your fighter, your thief, and your mage, and they're exploring this particular room. And they decide to look around the room, determine if there are any traps or anything like that. This is all the adventure phase. So the adventure phase is everything that the party is doing when they're not in combat, or when they're not in a situation that could lead to combat. So you're checking for traps, you're determining whether or not you've stumbled over any traps, because the DM will constantly be making those checks. You'll be solving puzzles, you'll be finding loot, all that sort of thing. The encounters begin when you get bad guys showing up. So let's say you got some bad guys show up. So once these bad guys show up, we're no longer in the adventure phase. We are now in the encounter phase. And this can go multiple ways depending on how things play out. So the first thing that happens when the encounter phase shows up is that you need to roll initiative. And this is determined by rolling a d6 in Dungeons & Dragons Basic, whereas, of course, in later editions you would be rolling a d20. So in this one, we're rolling a d6. Let's roll for the party first. So the party rolls a 3. Now we're going to roll for the monsters here. And that's cocked. They also rolled a 3. So they're actually going simultaneously. Now here's the thing. Depending on the way that the party plays out, and depending on the way that the encounter is set up, this doesn't necessarily lead to combat. It could just be that the action is resolved peacefully by everybody coming together and discussing things first, and then once everything has been diffused, then everybody goes on their merry way and the encounter phase ends. But we're not going to assume that. We're going to assume that the encounter ends in bloodshed. So, for the sake of argument, I'm going to take this party's roll, and I'm going to bump it up. So, we're going to say that the party goes first here, just to make things a little bit easier for you. So, the party goes first. The encounter begins in combat. So, here's how combat works in D&D Basic. Unlike in later editions of D&D, where every single character rolls initiative and you determine initiative order, D&D Basic has 2 orders for the slots. You are either first or you are second, and that is it. So, the party acts as one, and the monsters act as one. So, let's switch over to the new narrative time, because the adventure takes place in 10-minute increments, each being a turn, and you have to rest at least once every 6 turns, because every hour of adventure needs at least 10 minutes of rest. And once you're in combat, it switches over to turns being 10 seconds. So, in the span of the 10-second turn that your party takes, we're going to say that the fighter goes up and decides to whack this guy in the face. We're also going to say that the thief managed to somehow sneak around and will be stabbing this guy in the back. Meanwhile, the mage is hanging back here and is going to cast a spell. So, everybody does this in the span of their 10-second turn. The fighter rolls to make an attack against the bad guy. In this instance, you roll a d20. I'm going to move these out of the way first. And we're going to say that this bad guy has an armor class of 9. So, we're going to roll a d20. We rolled a 15. This is good. So, how do we determine whether or not he actually hit the enemy? We're going to just say it's an orc of some kind. I'm not using the actual stats that are listed in the D&D book, of course. I'm just going off of some very basic things just so you have a general idea here. So we rolled a 15. We add any modifiers to our attack roll, and so let's just say that the whole total comes out to an even 20 just to make it easy. So, he has an armor class of 9. So, we consult the book, because in D&D Basic, unlike in later editions of Dungeons & Dragons, you do not roll against an armor class value and determine whether or not you succeed based on a math calculation. You roll against a table to determine whether or not you succeed. So, we consult the table. The table lists first to third attacker level, which the fighter is going to be level 1, so he falls into that category. We look at what he needs to roll in order to beat the defender's armor class. So the defender's armor class is listed on values from 9 all the way up to -3. This is something else you need to keep in mind about Dungeons & Dragons Basic and also D&D Advanced, or Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition and all that. In the early versions of Dungeons & Dragons, armor class is actually negative as opposed to positive. So when you get to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they actually give you a calculation to do, but in the case of D&D Basic, they give you a nice handy table. So, you think about it this way. You subtract the armor class value from whatever the person rolled, and then you determine whether or not that still hits. So, let's say we rolled a 20. I'm just going to give me a second here. Make it a bit easier on you. There we go. So let's say we rolled a 20, just to make things easy. We consult the table. So the minimum we would need to hit something with an armor class of 9 is a 10. Obviously, we beat that. But the way this actually works mechanically is that you take the armor class and you subtract it from the roll. So we rolled a 20. We subtract 9 from that, we get 11. When you compare that to the armor class, is it still at or above that armor class? If so, then it still hits. That's the calculation. It's actually a very simple calculation when you get down to it. And the armor class value is something that would definitely get expanded upon in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and it would be explained a bit better in later editions when they decided to go positive AC instead of negative AC. But it's a simple calculation, it makes sense, it's not hard to actually put together. It's just that D&D Basic uses a table instead to make it a bit easier and quicker for you. So, the attack succeeds. Now we roll damage. Now, damage in D&D Basic is determined one of two different ways. Either you roll based on variable weapon damage, which is an optional rule, actually. The original version of D&D Basic, you just rolled the same damage regardless. You rolled 1d6 for damage no matter what you were using. But we're going to use the variable weapon damage table. Now, remember how I said that our fighter was using a two-handed sword. So, you roll 1d10. So, let's take this, if I can find my d10 here. Okay, we're going to roll a d10 for damage. Not great. We rolled a 3. So you add any damage modifiers to that, you get the damage inflicted upon the bad guy. It's not a big deal. You repeat this process for any additional attacks. So, the thief makes an attack, blah blah blah. We're going to ultimately assume that somehow, through the magic of making things up arbitrarily, this particular bad guy ends up dying. So, turn 1, pretty successful on that. But then there's the mage. So the mage is casting spells. Now, since this mage is a level 1 mage, he only gets one spell. And he can only cast it once. You see, the way that spells work in Dungeons & Dragons, and this is true across all editions, but especially so in older versions, is that you can only cast your spells once per certain time period. Now, in more recent versions of D&D, that's basically once per rest. In the case of D&D Basic, it was one of two different ways. Either once per day, if the adventure lasts multiple days, or once per adventure. Because the book explicitly says that adventures usually don't take more than a couple of hours. So you only get your one spell, and that's it. The entire adventure, you cast your spell and you're done. So, mages in old versions of D&D were incredibly wimpy, in case you can't tell. Regardless, we are going to assume that this particular mage is going to cast Magic Missile. So, when you cast Magic Missile, you do 1d6 plus 1 damage to any creature it strikes. So, in this particular case, we're going to assume that it hit this bad guy. You take your d6, you roll your damage. We did 3. We're rolling a lot of 3s today. So we actually did 4 damage to this particular bad guy. Yay. It's a pretty straightforward process, but here's the thing. Now that mage has cast a spell, no longer has any spells available. So once all the characters in the party go, the turn ends. It moves over to their turn. So seeing that their buddy got massacred, they're going to attempt to avenge him. This one comes up here, this one comes over here, and they both try to clobber the fighter. They're going to make rolls of their own now. The thing is, they actually consult a different table. So, when it comes to various attacks, you have 2 different tables that you had to consult. You have the character attacks, which are in the case of NPCs and player characters, and you have monster attacks in the case of monsters. We're going to assume that these are monsters. So they're going to roll a d20. And you actually determine based on their hit dice as to whether or not they're going to be able to hit. So we're going to assume that this guy right here, who I'm going to tint red on his base, and this guy here, who I'm going to tint blue on his base, just so you can easily tell the difference between them. We're going to say that the red guy has 5 hit dice. And we're going to say that the blue guy has, 20 hit dice. Just to make things crazy. So this guy has 5 hit dice. So we consult the table. And we check at what he rolled here. He rolled an 8. And we're going to say that plus modifiers, he ended up with a 10. So, we consult the table. With 5, he would need to hit this fighter's armor class, which, given that he is wearing plate mail, is actually 3. So, in order to hit an armor class of 3, this particular enemy would actually need to have rolled a 12. Since we said that he rolled a 10, he did not succeed. Meanwhile, the blue guy tries to hit him. We're going to roll the die on that. He rolled a 7. And since I said that this particular guy has hit dice above even what the table says, so he has hit dice of 20, we consult the table again. What does he need to hit an armor class of 3? He only needed a 4. He succeeds on his hit. And then, of course, you roll damage accordingly. Now, here's the interesting thing about rolling attacks in general. A 20 always hits, no matter what. And a 1 always misses, no matter what. This is basically the origin of the critical hit and critical miss system. Now, critical misses have never really been an actual rule in D&D. They've always been an optional rule, but I've never really known any DMs to not use them. Regardless, that's the origin of the critical hit and critical miss system, is the fact that 20s always hit and 1s always miss. It's pretty straightforward. But we resolve everything here. We're going to say that the fighter is still standing after all of that. Round goes back to the party. Party manages to take down both of these guys. So, the party is victorious. At this point, they're going to make note of any of the loot that they get, and the DM is going to make note of the hit dice that all of these creatures had, because that's how you determine the experience points that they are going to receive for killing all of these enemies. And the party is going to go about its adventuring. Once all of the adventuring is done, then it's actually going to be time to tally up the actual results. So, of course, you all have the treasure that you determine amongst yourselves, whether or not you're going to give it all to one person, or whether you're going to split it evenly, or whatever the case may be. But the DM determines how much experience everyone gets. Now, in order to level up from level 1 to level 2, you need at least 2,000 experience points. It seems like a lot, and it is. Adventures in D&D Basic tend to be on the low impact side. So, we're going to assume that through some crazy miracle, you manage to level up. So once you level up, which we're going to assume all 3 of these characters did, then it comes time to add any additional bonuses. So the mage gets an extra spell. That's a given. But the fighter and the thief also get their own bonuses. They get to roll additional hit dice. So, a fighter rolls d8 for hit points. So we're going to say that the fighter rolls and only adds 1 additional hit point. It's a shame. Then we're also going to say that the thief rolls. So the thief actually rolls 1d4 for hit points. The thief managed to roll 2, so thief adds 2 additional hit points. The mage also rolls a d4 for hit points. Only adds 1. This is a really squishy mage. Anyway, that's basically the extent of bonuses you get for thieves and fighters and other non-spell-wielding classes. The system for leveling up is very simplistic in Dungeons & Dragons Basic, and you never really need to worry about any sort of crazy customizations. The thing is, of course, it doesn't really have much actual customization. You just roll for additional hit points, and that's pretty much it, except in the case of mages and clerics. Mages and clerics get to take the advantage of additional spells. So mages, of course, inscribe new spells into their spellbook. With regards to clerics, since this will be the first time that a cleric is coming up, we're going to go ahead and just assume that this ranger is a cleric. Cleric spells work differently from wizard spells, or magic user and elf spells, I should say, in that clerics do not need to memorize their spells from a spell book. They don't need to basically be taught their spells. They can select any spells that they have access to from a given level. So, if we consult the list of first level clerical spells, since this cleric just became level 2, then we're going to say that this particular cleric really wants the Cure Light Wounds spell. Great. So what the cleric actually has to do is just simply pray for that spell, and they will get it. Now, of course, like a magic user, they can only cast that spell once per day or once per adventure, depending on the time frame of the adventure you're dealing with here. But they don't need to specifically memorize one spell and that be the only spell they have access to. So let's say the next day rolls around and they want a different spell. Let's say they want Detect Magic instead. Well, instead of praying for Cure Light Wounds, they'll simply pray for Detect Magic, and they'll get Detect Magic. It's basically the only major difference between clerical spells and mage spells. The difference being, of course, that clerical spells usually are not particularly powerful until you get to really high levels or anything. Of course, spells in general are not all that great in old school D&D anyway. They didn't get great until later on when you got to AD&D and 3rd edition and all that. But suffice to say, the clerics are actually very straightforward as far as spellcasters go in D&D Basic, more so than mages, because mages are really underpowered. But that's actually pretty much it. There's not a whole lot to Dungeons & Dragons Basic. It really does live up to its name of D&D Basic, because you're not really dealing with a whole lot of additional modifiers. I mean, it's mostly just +1s, -1s, and that's about it. The armor class values don't get crazily out of hand for the most part. That table that is listed in the book is all you're ever really going to need. And even if somehow you do manage to go past what the table shows, then it's a pretty simple and straightforward calculation, so that's never anything you need to worry about either. And it all facilitates a pretty straightforward dungeon crawling experience. The main issue with D&D Basic is that if you're trying to play it as a proper role-playing game, it doesn't really facilitate that all that well. There's no skills that you can use to improve various scenarios. You can't really roll against, say, your commerce skill or something like that in order to determine whether or not you're going to get a discount. It's all basically determined by the DM, and that's pretty much it. So in conclusion, Dungeons & Dragons is definitely a lot more of a dungeon crawling adventure game than it is a tabletop role-playing game. But it does have all the fundamental aspects there. It's just that they're in a very simplified, very basic form, living up to the name D&D Basic. But if you're wanting something that's definitely much more of a proper role-playing game, I would definitely recommend other versions of D&D before I would even bother attempting to play this one. And even if you're just looking for a simple dungeon crawl kind of game, D&D Basic is okay at that, but it's so simple that it may still not scratch that itch very well. If you are going to play D&D Basic, I would recommend that you actually start at higher levels than level 1, probably level 3 or 4, and that is simply so you can actually feel relatively powerful compared to what you start out with, which is absolutely pathetic. And in those instances, I would recommend you playing it as a one-shot, as opposed to doing a full campaign with it. Because the problem with campaigns in D&D Basic is that even compared to the likes of, say, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they are painfully slow-paced. And the mere fact that you need so much experience to level up, and the fact that the level ups are so bare bones and give you almost nothing in terms of improvement, is rather tedious. So it also doesn't help that you need at least 2 books to be able to play the game for more than 4 levels. So the first book of D&D Basic, whether it's BECME or BX, only goes up to level 4. Now, the difference is that BECME continues to splice up the levels into the E, C, M, and I books, whereas D&D Basic BX Edition only goes up to Expert, which is levels 5 through 14. So that's something else to keep in mind there. You don't get literally everything with D&D Basic if you only have the basic rulebook. You have the first 4 levels. And in that instance, it's almost like a starter set, and that's basically what D&D Basic was intended to be. It's really meant to be a sort of starter set to get you interested in this whole idea, and to make it fairly quick and easy to play a dungeon crawling adventure semi-role-playing game. And the idea was that if you liked what you saw here, then you might expand it by, of course, getting the Expert book, or if you, by the time Advanced Dungeons & Dragons came out, were even more interested in the actual role-playing aspects and the more complexities, then you might want to go ahead and pick up Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Obviously, we have alternatives these days. If you want to get into Dungeons & Dragons, I would recommend that you start with 5th edition, because 5th edition is a lot easier to understand, it's a lot easier to set up, and it has basically everything you need to play a proper role-playing game, while the books are also very well organized, and it is all very straightforwardly written. So that's something that they have definitely improved upon over the years. If you want to play more of the tabletop wargame experience, well, there's better options than D&D Basic, let me put it that way. And even within D&D, that's basically what 4th edition was intended to be. It's much more of a war game than it is a role-playing game. And there's a reason that most people hate D&D 4th edition, let me put it that way. But suffice to say, Basic occupies an interesting spot in role-playing game history. And if you're interested in playing something like this, then there are a few retro clones available, like, say, Labyrinth Lord, and you can try those. The D&D Basic rulebooks are still available for purchase. I actually will have a link in the video description box where you can pick up the BX and BECME editions. If you are interested in those, then feel free to get those and set up a game and give it a try, because it's a pretty easy game to set up and play, even though the book is not particularly well written and can be confusing at times, just because it's not very well laid out, and it's definitely a product of its time. It's from the late 70s, early 80s, what do you expect? But if you do decide to pick this up and give it a try, then definitely let me know in the comments how it goes for you, because D&D Basic is a very different experience if you're used to, of course, more recent editions of Dungeons & Dragons or other role-playing games in general, or even if you've never played a role-playing game before and you thought that Basic would be a good spot to start because it's fairly straightforward and it doesn't really have any of the heavy connotations of role-playing that you may be expecting if, for example, you, say, watch Critical Role or something like that, and you're used to the amount of role-playing that they put into their stuff. Now, D&D Basic is definitely a very mechanical experience. It's very different compared to really all the other editions of Dungeons & Dragons, including AD&D, which is pretty much mechanically this, but heavily expanded. And especially with more recent editions simplifying a lot of things, it's interesting to see how the different changes and simplifications that are made over the years still aren't really what you saw with the Basic edition way back in the day. At any rate, I hope you all like this video. I hope you all enjoy the continued content that I'm going to be putting together for this tabletop series, which will eventually be including some actual tabletop campaigns, so stay tuned for those. But aside from that, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.